In August 1941, the camps of the 1st Moscow Red Banner Artillery School, named after L.B. Kresin, presented an unusual picture. Tents were urgently stretched in the forest, commanders' huts were filled with new people, wooden barracks were occupied by newly created, literally in a few days, headquarters. Regiments of multiple launch rocket artillery were being formed. We learned about the new secret weapon in early August, being in the reserve of the Stavka. But first I must tell you how I got into this reserve. There is a Belorusky station in Moscow, from which thousands of people leave and to which thousands of people arrive every day. For them it is usual, as well as other stations of the capital. But to me this station reminds me of joyful and anxious days. In 1939 I graduated from the Frunze Military Academy, and from the Belorusky station I was escorted to the city of Rikitsa by my wife, the companion of my combat life, my infinitely dear children, black-eyed Galia and grey-eyed Vovka. Friends congratulated me on my appointment as commander of the 170th Artillery Regiment of the 37th Rifle Division. We were young, strong, full of energy. At that time I turned 31 years old. To be the commander of an artillery regiment is a great honour, but having no experience in commanding even a division, I was very anxious. All the time did not give rest to the thought, will I cope? True, I received my baptism of fire in 1929 under the cities of Chalonor and Manchuria during the conflict on the Chinese Eastern Railway. I was sent to the active army immediately after graduating from the Tomsk Artillery School. I was appointed commander of a firing platoon in howitzer battery of the 21st Artillery Regiment. In the battles with the White Chinese, our battery twice repelled infantry and cavalry counterattacks by fire from open positions. Already then I learned the power and strength of artillery fire, and was proud that my combat service began in artillery. In August 1939, our 170th Artillery Regiment, as part of the 37th Infantry Division from the city of Rikitse, went to Kholkhin to crush the samurai who invaded the territory of the Mongolian People's Republic. However, we did not have to participate in the battles, as our troops under the command of G.K. Zhukov defeated the samurai invading the territory of the Mongolian People's Republic. K. Zhukov defeated the Japanese militarists, and our help was no longer needed. The 37th Infantry Division, including our regiment, were left in Siberia. In the same year, 1939, the 170th Regiment, as part of the same 37th Infantry Division, was transferred from Siberia to the Petrozavodskaya direction and participated in battles with the White Finns. For these battles, we and the regiment Commissar N.D. Vishnyakov were awarded the Order of the Red Star. On June 23, 1941, on the second day of the Great Patriotic War, the 170th Artillery Regiment engaged in an unequal battle with Nazi tank columns. It was near the village of Tovstyuny, which is 35 kilometers from the city of Lyda. Then fights took place on the river Zhizhma at the station Govya near the settlements Ivy, Rubizhovichi, Negorilay. With heavy fighting we had to retreat, but we still made tangible blows on the enemy outnumbering us. With units of my regiment I broke through the encirclement. We came out with weapons in our hands, in full uniform. We managed to fight our way to Mosia, from where we were sent to Gomel. In Gomel, the soldiers and sergeants who came out of the encirclement were ordered to be transferred to the newly formed units of the 21st Army, and I, with a group of officers of the 170th Artillery Regiment, was sent to the reserve of the Western Front near Moscow. And so in the first days of July 1941 I arrived again at the Belorusky railway station. The platform and all its premises were crowded with military men, wounded, evacuated old men, women, children. A huge grief had fallen on our country. The enemy was tearing towards Leningrad, Odessa, Kiev, Kharkov. Heavy battles were fought near Smolensk, Yartsevo, Yelnya. We did not know what happened to our families, who stayed in Lepel and Vitebsk. Before going to the reserve of the Western Front, I decided to visit the Central Committee of the party and the Operational Department of the General Staff. I realized that the workers of the Central Committee and the General Staff were especially busy now, and maybe everything I would inform them about would not be new to them. But my soul was burning, and I considered it my party duty to tell the Central Committee about the first battles with the Nazis, about the fighting of the 37th Infantry Division, about the withdrawal of its remnants from the encirclement, to tell about the situation in the first days of the war for the 21st Infantry Corps, and in particular for our 170th Artillery Regiment, to tell about the courage and fortitude of the soldiers and commanders, to express my thoughts. The matter was facilitated by the fact that my comrade V. A. Frolov worked in the Central Committee. At one time he gave me a recommendation to the party. I still have his telephone number from before the war. I decided to summarize my thoughts on paper. At the station I bought 3 student notebooks at a kiosk and got a couple of sheets of copy paper. There, at the station, I wrote a report in 3 copies. We signed the letter together with political officer N. I. Gribkov. With this document I went to the Central Committee. Frolov received me warmly, listened attentively to my story and suggestions, informed me, of course, within limits, about the activities carried out by the Central Committee and the government to mobilize forces and means for a decisive repulse of the enemy. Frolov's message cheered me up and encouraged me. My heart became lighter. Frolov promised to report my letter to the leadership. He advised me to keep my spirits up and wished me good luck in the hard and severe fight with the enemy. Encouraged and inspired, I went to the Operations Directorate of the General Staff. I took with me the battle banner of the 170th Artillery Regiment, which we had taken out of the encirclement. We were sure that under this banner we would still fight. Returning to the station, I told my comrades in arms about the results of my visit to the Central Committee and the General Staff. With the first train we left for Meshcheskaya station in the reserve of the Western Front. And here we are already in place. In the evening I lay down to rest in a hastily made hut on an unfolded cloak tent, which from the first days of the war replaced my overcoat and bed, and then served as a cover for the battle banner. The overhanging crowns of birch trees overhung the tent. Everything in nature was calm and majestic, and I was overcome by heavy thoughts. It is not easy in the first unequal battles to lose the regiment, experienced combat friends, have no information about the family and tormented by thoughts that it could fall into enemy hands, and then the disappointing reports of the Sovinform Bureau. My heavy thoughts were interrupted by the Chief of Intelligence of our regiment, Senior Lieutenant N. Golikov, a man of great courage. It was he who saved the regiment's banner. Comrade Commander, on the Western Front our troops used a new secret cannon, he excitedly reported. They say that it terrifies Hitlerites with its fire. This information in secret was passed from mouth to mouth. They said that the new powerful weapon in a short time creates a sea of fire, that the fascists fled from Orsha in panic. They said, how I wanted to believe that all this was not fiction, but the truth. A few days later I received an order from the Field Department of the Western Front. I was ordered to urgently go to the 16th Army, which fought at Yelnya and Yartsevo, and in its artillery units to select 8 officers. At my disposal was allocated a semi-truck with an experienced driver. Senior commanders were ordered to provide me with full assistance in the fulfillment of the task. On the second day I was in the active army. Arriving in artillery units, after presenting my documents I asked to name the best division and battery commanders. To tell the truth, I was not very happy to be given this information. I understood the commanders who wants to give the best officers, and even during heavy fighting. But an order is an order. I happen to have a copy of one of the orders of that time. Here it is. The commander of 721 Gap. The army commander ordered selected by the representative of the Zap Front Major Nestorenko commanders immediately seconded to the personnel department of the Zap Front. In case of absence of these commanders in the unit, immediately replace them on the instructions of Major Nestorenko from among the best combat commanders. The document was signed on August 8, 1941 by the Chief of Staff of the 16th Army, Colonel Shaliyev, and Military Commissar Sedenkov. It took me 2 days to fulfill the order of the Field Department of the Western Front. By the specified date, I arrived with a group of commanders in the camps of the 1st Moscow Red Banner Artillery School, named after Elo. B. Krasin. Here worked a commission of the Central Committee of the party. It selected officers for parts of reactive artillery. The formation of regiments was entrusted to the head of the school, Colonel Yuri Pavlovich Bazanov, now Marshal of Artillery. This tall, richly built officer was distinguished by his stern demeanor. Powerful, loud voice, decisive, confident movements testified to an extraordinary force of will. The headquarters of the formation was headed by Lieutenant Colonel V.I. Zadorin. Military roads then more than once brought me together with them. The list of officers with whom I arrived was ordered to submit to the Central Committee Commission. After a while I myself was invited there. The chairman of the commission asked me to tell about myself, about my combat path, about how I found myself in the reserve. The members of the commission also asked a lot of questions. Finally, they told me that I could go out and wait for a decision. They invited me in about 10 minutes, for the rest of my life remembered as the chairman of the commission solemnly announced, "Comrade Nestorenko, you are appointed commander of the 4th Guards Mortar Regiment of Rocket Artillery Reserve of the Supreme High Command." From the joy and excitement of the heart beat, so that was heard every beat, excitedly thanked the commission for the high trust and promised to justify it with honor. I was warned that the weapon is secret, so when starting to form a regiment we must be especially careful to select personnel. In farewell, the chairman of the commission shook my hand and said, "Do not lose time, get down to business. Detailed instructions will be given to you in the headquarters of the formation." Following me, the commission invited Captain Nevada Skurda, who was seconded from the 16th Army and arrived with me. "Assigned to the 2nd Regiment," he said, leaving after about 10 minutes. "What do you mean in the 2nd? I was surprised. Why not in the 4th? Again, I go to the place where the Central Committee Commission met. I ask that Skurda and all the officers who arrived with me from the 16th Army sent to the 4th Regiment. Good officers are needed in other regiments too. With a smile told me the chairman of the commission, but promised to fulfill the request. I also asked that all officers of the 170th Artillery Regiment be assigned to the 4th Regiment from the reserve. However, I was told that they had probably already received new assignments. I was about to leave the reception room, when suddenly a young, short officer with 3 cubes in his buttonholes appeared in the doorway. I could not believe my eyes. In front of me, smiling broadly, stood my pupil from the Tomsk Artillery School V.M. Solomin. We hugged tightly. "Volodya, apply for the 4th Regiment," I said. He left and I was worried. What if they refuse him? And again I rushed to the cherished door for the 3rd time. Our request was granted. Solomin was assigned to my regiment as Assistant Chief of Staff. He was a remarkably capable and efficient officer. His contribution to the formation of the regiment is difficult to overestimate. The selection of people, the creation of the regiment's headquarters, all this lay on him. Could I have thought then that in December of the 41st Volodya Solomin would die a hero's death? In the battles near Verkhnaya Lyubovskaya, commanding a division, he called the fire on himself to stop the furious attacks of the enemy. Conscripts, future Guards soldiers were arriving to the camps in a continuous stream. On the basis of the order of the Supreme High Command, the formation of the first 8 regiments of rocket artillery was started here. The newly created regiments were named Guards Mortar Artillery Regiments of the Reserve of the Supreme High Command. Teams of conscripts consisted mainly of Muscovites and residents of the Moscow region, communists and Komsomol members. Thus, our 4th Guards Regiment was 2/3 staffed by communists and Komsomol members. And later on, Komsomol units were created, such as the 85th Guards Komsomol Mortar Regiment. Day and night worked the regiment headquarters. Until the arrival of the Chief of Staff, Captain I. Gromov, all the work was carried out under the leadership of Senior Lieutenant V.M. Solomin. He was greatly assisted by Senior Lieutenant G. A. Drozdov, one of the first officers who arrived in the regiment. Comrades from the Commission of the Central Committee of the Party, the commander of the Moscow Military District, General P. A. Artemiev, a member of the Military Council of the district, K.F. Telegin, were constantly interested in the progress of the formation. When will they give the combat units? Impatiently asked J.P. Bazanov, regimental commanders. You will get them when you swear in the Guards, he replied, and for now, study weapons means of communication. You have a lot of work. There was indeed a lot of work. The formation was going on around the clock. We had to solve simultaneously a lot of urgent organizational issues to select those arriving by specialties, to distribute them among the units, finally to feed, wash, haircut them. It was necessary to receive uniforms and equipment, weapons and transport vehicles, to form combat units and rear services, to create party and Komsomol organizations, to solve the issues of clothing and money allowances, technical support. On the fourth day after the beginning of the formation arrived Regiment Commissar N. Radchenko, who had just graduated from the Lenin Military and Political Academy. He found my tent in the woods, clearly military style, introduced himself. High, trim, in a new, well-fitting uniform, Battalion Commissar Radchenko made a good impression. However, I immediately remembered another man, the commissar of our 170th Artillery Regiment ND, Vishnyakov. This is with whom I would again like to fight shoulder to shoulder, but alas, he was no longer alive. I became the commander of the 170th Artillery Regiment in April 1939, and soon Nikolai Danilovich Vishnyakov, for me just Kolya, was appointed commissar. With him we studied together in the Tomsk Artillery School. He was an erudite, richly gifted, soulful man, a great optimist. In his cadet years he was considered an unsurpassed dancer, had a good voice, willingly sang in company and amateur art concerts. After graduation from art school, Vishnyakov, like me, commanded a platoon in an artillery regiment and participated in battles with the White Chinese during the conflict on the Sel. Then he commanded a battery, was a pomnikstab of the regiment. In May 1939, Nikolai Danilovich graduated from the Lenin Military and Political Academy and came to us. I could not dream of a better commissar. In the battles with the White Finns, Vishnyakov fought bravely. At this time, his extraordinary military talent was especially bright. Vishnyakov's appearance in the units always left an indelible impression on his subordinates. He seemed to radiate optimism and energy. It was a man beautiful internally and externally. People were drawn to him, opened their souls to him, shared their sorrows and joys. Nikolai Danilovich did everything with some extraordinary rise, easily, simply, joyfully. He knew perfectly well artillery and rifle business, material part of artillery. Besides, he was a fiery orator, an excellent lecturer and methodologist. He was fond of equestrian sport and was a good horseman, had a great command of the checker. Everyone loved and deeply respected him for his knowledge of the business, soulfulness, simplicity and versatility. We often went out with him in the evenings to the riding arena, to cut vines, to compete in overcoming obstacles. I often thought about how generously nature rewarded him with all the best human qualities, how easy and pleasant it was to work with him. His sound, clear mind, his optimism always helped in solving controversial issues. He was a real commissar. Our friendship with him was tested in battles. Before the war, Vishnyakov was appointed commissar of the newly formed anti-tank fighter brigade near Grodno. Participating in the reflection of a tank attack on one of the first days of the war, he died a brave death. I was later told about his heroic death by the commander of the division, Captain P.N. Gusha. Getting acquainted with the new commissar, I thought about Vishnyakov, mentally asked Radchenko, "Can you be like him? Otherwise it will be difficult for us to work together." Fortunately for me, in the character of Commissioner Radchenko was a lot of traits inherent in Vishnyakov. I was pleased to learn that Radchenko, like Vishnyakov, before entering the academy commanded a battery and knows artillery and gunnery perfectly. Before the army, Radchenko worked as a chauffeur, has a driver's license of the first class. To have a commissar who knows automobile equipment perfectly well is not bad at all. I immediately asked him to take control of the selection of drivers of combat vehicles and auto-technical staff of the regiment. In response, Radchenko smiled and said with confidence, "I think I can cope with this task." We quickly found a common language with him, and our work went amicably. From the first days of his stay in the regiment, the commissar focused on the study of personnel, communists and Komsomol members, the creation of party and Komsomol organizations in the units, political training and political informations, providing soldiers with newspapers. Business qualities of the commissar, his tactfulness and cordiality won him respect among the regiment's personnel. In the units, as they were staffed, immediately began combat training and political classes. All soldiers, before receiving combat vehicles, studied rifles, grenades, pistols. Firing exercises with personal weapons were conducted. As soon as the first combat units arrived, with the command staff of the regiment immediately organized classes to master them. The training was as follows. The unit under a cover was brought to the forest, to a clearing. A guard was posted around it. Classes were conducted by officers from the main artillery directorate, militarymen and engineers from the compressor plant, where these combat vehicles were manufactured. I remember that the appearance of the unit under the tarpaulin cover resembled a pontoon, and when the cover was removed, before our surprised gazes appeared an ordinary 3-axle truck C6, on the chassis of which was mounted some metal truss. What is the formidable power of this very simple machine, we mentally asked ourselves. We were given very scanty information about the BM-13 combat vehicle data on the range of fire, speed. Our lecturers became especially terse when it came to the projectile. Information about it was given only within the limits of operational necessity. We were told how to store shells, how to transport them, how to handle them, how to set the fuse for fragmentation and delayed action. The soldier must know how to handle the machine and the shell, we were emphasized. The warhead of the projectile consists of. In the rocket chamber there are powder pellets. And further it was shown how to disassemble the projectile in case of malfunction. But more detailed information was given about how the launcher is loaded, how it is aimed, how the rate of fire is ensured. By the way, rocket shells were given the conventional name mine. Combat vehicles were sometimes called combat rigs, sometimes guns, but never mortars. What was a combat vehicle? On the 3-axle chassis of the car Z6 was installed metal truss, on which mounted a package of 8 5-meter steel I-beams. To facilitate the combat installation, round holes were drilled along the entire length of each beam. The truss with a package of rails was firmly connected to the rotating frame. The rig had a simple design of swivel and lifting mechanisms, a bracket for a sight with the usual artillery panorama, and an iron fuel tank attached to the rear of the cab. 2 folding jacks were mounted on the rear of the chassis. The cab windows were covered with armoured hinged shields. Against the commander's seat on the front panel was mounted a small rectangular box with a turntable, resembling the disc of a telephone set, and a handle for turning the disc. There were 16 numbers on the disc. This device was called a fire control panel, abbreviated as a fire control unit. A harness of conductors ran from the console to a special battery and to each guide. At one turn of the fire control panel handle, the electric circuit was short-circuited. The squib, placed in the front part of the rocket chamber of the projectile, was activated, the reactive charge was ignited, and the shot was fired. The rate of fire was determined by the rate of rotation of the firing handle. 16 shells from BM-13 could be fired in 8 to 10 seconds. It took literally a few hours for a trained artilleryman to learn the combat vehicle. The simplicity of the new installations was due to the use of reactive force in the combustion of the powder charge. The projectile was not fired from a solid barrel under great pressure of powder gases, as it happened in artillery systems, but was gradually accelerated along the guide and then gained the required speed during the entire time of burning of the reactive charge. After the first familiarization with the combat vehicles and the device of rockets, it became clear to us that the main thing in this new artillery is not the installations, but self-propelled projectiles. Heavy and expensive guns were not required here, and the rocket shells of that time, after their development and finalization in production, were not more expensive than artillery shells of the same caliber, especially if we compare them with shrapnel shells, which had double-acting distance tubes, strong steel, perfectly milled bodies, rather complex profile of the head and ogival part, and a special leading belt. So, the M13 rocket shell consisted of a rocket chamber with a powder charge body, head part with a bursting charge, fuse, detonator, igniter, squib, grate, nozzle, fairing, 4 stabilizers, and 2 guides. In the rocket chamber were inserted powder pellets, the composition of the powder of which we did not know. We did not know the composition of the explosive charge either, but we did not need it. We had to know the striking and destructive effect of the shells, the rules of handling them, the causes of failure of the installation and ways of their elimination. For the commanders of regiments, divisions, batteries and political officers soon organised a demonstration firing. 2 BM-13 vehicles were placed in specially dug trenches. From them visible only packages of guides and part of the truss. On the top rails of each machine were 8 shells. The machines were placed so that the guides had a low angle of elevation. We positioned ourselves in trenches 150 to 200 meters from the firing position. The route of firing passed through a gully, behind which targets' wooden shields were placed on the field with a slope in our direction. It was a warm August morning. In some places in the lowlands there was still fog. The field with targets was flooded with bright rays of the sun. The silence was extraordinary. The eyes of all present were turned towards the loaded combat vehicles. The head of the firing, Colonel Y.P. Bajanov, announced that first one shell would be fired, and then a salvo of 7 more shells from the first combat vehicle. At the signal of the leader, the first shot was fired. A jet of fire flew out of one shell, then it took off from the place, and with an unusual noise, penetrating the morning silence, raced along the guide and flew, gaining more and more speed. Following it stretched a fiery tail with a bright white flare at the very nozzle. Gradually the white flame of the flare changed to orange-red, leaving behind a grey cloud. After a few seconds at a distance of 300 to 400 meters from the launcher, the flare disappeared, and a powerful explosion occurred in the area of the target field. The grass around the exploded shell first smoked and then caught fire. This was followed by the command first installation fire. The shells one after another came off the guides, and just like the first one, leaving behind them long tails of fire, with a grinding and hissing noise rushed to the target. Explosions sounded with a thunderous roar in the area of the targets, and pockets of fire erupted. Grass and bushes were burning. In a few minutes we were taken by cars to the targets. All of them were hit by numerous fragments. The craters were small, but the impact zone exceeded the impact zones of 122 and 152 mm howitzer shells. The fires were caused by an incendiary substance, thermite, which was added to the bursting charge. We saw that the striking effect of the new weapon is large. By 8 fired shells, we could imagine what would be a divisional, and even more so a regimental volley. Commanders estimated the density of fire, the area of impact of battery and divisional salvos. They expressed their delight briefly. Great, wow, that's power. The commissar said to me on the way, "Well, Commander, we'll give the fascist bastards a light. It's only 8, but what if we fire a regimental volley?" Guards Mortar Regiment was a complex organisation. So in our regiment there were 3 divisions armed with BM-13 combat vehicles and an anti-aircraft division. Total 1,414 people, including 137 officers, 260 sergeants, 1,017 privates. The regiment's staffs provided for a political department. The regiment had 36 combat vehicles, 12 anti-aircraft 37mm guns, 9 anti-aircraft and 18 hand machine guns, as well as 343 cargo and special vehicles. The divisions of our regiment were of 3 battery composition, with 4 16-round combat vehicles per battery. The salvo of the division was 192 shells, and the salvo of the regiment 576 shells of 132mm caliber. All of them could be fired literally in seconds. This is a sea of fire. That's why at Orsha the fascists fled in panic from the volley of Flerov's battery. So the demonstration firing demonstrated the power of a new type of artillery. We immediately faced the task to learn how to skillfully use this formidable weapon, to study the nature and peculiarities of the dispersion of shells, fire and manoeuvring capabilities of batteries, divisions, regiment. We had no rules of firing, no manuals and instructions on the use of this artillery, and in general there were none, except for a small instruction. A new weapon was born, and creative initiative and daring were required from us. The instructions on the combat use of rocket artillery mainly stated that this weapon was secret, and provided for measures to cover and support it. It was strictly forbidden to bring to the firing positions of combat vehicles without cover. After firing a salvo, it was required to immediately withdraw to a safe place. It was specified that the fire should be conducted en masse on large concentrations of the enemy. As an artilleryman who already had considerable combat experience, it was not difficult for me to imagine the tasks that could be performed by the regiment's units. However, it was still necessary to find a common language with the commanders of divisions and batteries, so that in battle we understood each other with half a word. After the demonstration firing, without wasting time, we began field battery and division exercises. Special attention was paid to the training of battery and division commanders, to their ability to navigate quickly and accurately on the map and on the ground to prepare initial data in any conditions. The best in their business and political qualities artillerymen were appointed as battery and division commanders. Therefore, the training was successful. In the staff of the regiment was provided for a special department of 4 officers who arrived in the first days of formation. They were M.I. Janovsky, Y.G. Ogenezov, V.F. Shadrin, D. Nikolenko. They had a lot of work even after the formation. The fascist command persistently tried to unravel the secret of such an effective weapon. For this purpose, spies and saboteurs were sent to us. Workers of the special department later showed themselves not only good security officers, but also brave officers. The regiment's senior doctor, a very young man with the rank of military doctor of the 3rd rank, was also assigned to the regiment. The meeting with him took place in the forest, near our tent with Radchenko. He approached with a clear, regimented step and reported in a shorthand, a little bit yelling. "Comrade Major, 3rd rank military Dr. Kolmanskik has arrived at your disposal." "Hello, Comrade Kolmansky." I answered him, marvelling at his youth and involuntarily thinking that a commission of the Central Committee could have appointed a more mature man to a Guards regiment armed with top-secret equipment. During the years of service in the army, I was used to seeing in the positions of chiefs of sanitary services of regiments wise with life and experience of medics. And this one is too young and unsolid in appearance. Not Kolmansky, but Kolmanskik. The new subordinate corrected me rather strictly. "Well, all right, Kolmanskik," I answered. "Sorry, I didn't hear you." It turned out that Kolmanskik, despite his youth, had already fought in the war. He was a doctor of a ski battalion during the battles on the Karelian Isthmus. He was awarded the Order of the Red Banner. As a participant of the war with the White Finns, I knew what heroism the ski battalions showed in battle. It was not easy for the doctor there either. "Well, Comrade Kolmanskik," I said, "I'm very glad that you are a man who has been shelled. In that case, start immediately to form the regiment's sanitary unit. Pick up people, get vehicles and medicines." "Yes, Comrade Major," he answered cheerfully. "I know what medicines are in battle. In 3 days report on readiness. If there are any difficulties, contact me at once." But he did not address me once during these 3 days, and on the appointed date reported that the regiment's sanitary unit was formed, the people were well chosen, 2 cars of medicines were received. Well done. I praised him. Now do not lose time, organize classes. There are only a few days left, and you need your medical staff to have time to prepare for independent action, and that all the medics could give first aid and evacuate the wounded. The fighting will be brutal. The formation of the regiment was coming to an end. We received 48 combat vehicles for all 4 divisions. They were supposed to be handed over after the personnel of the regiment took the oath. Taking the oath was held by divisions and services. For greater solemnity, it was decided to hand over the combat vehicles to the calculations in front of the regiment's formation. We developed a special ritual and prepared the text of the oath of the Guardsmen. In the woods, in a clearing, in front of the general formation, at a table covered with a red tablecloth, the unfurled battle banner of the 170th Artillery Regiment with a guard of honour was displayed. To the table alternately called calculations with installations. The commander of the combat vehicle, in front of the formation of his calculation, read out the text of the oath. After that, each guardsman signed it. The commander and the regiment commissar congratulated the missileers on the delivery of the formidable weapon and expressed confidence that the Guardsmen would honourably justify the high trust of the party and the government. September 14th, the day of handing over the calculations of combat vehicles, became a holiday for the newly formed team. No matter how busy the Missiliers were, with the help of the commissars of divisions and batteries, Radchenko managed to identify talents, musicians, singers, dancers and storytellers who on this solemn day were to perform an amateur concert. 2 trucks were placed side by side in the forest clearing. Their bodies became an improvised stage. There was also a club car with loudspeakers. Everyone was in high spirits, but the festive concert was not destined to take place. In the afternoon we received an order the regiment at night to go on its own way to Kharkov and get at the disposal of the commander of the Southwestern Front. The 4th Division, commanded by Captain N. S. Bogdanov, was ordered to go to Leningrad. The situation on the Southwestern Front was alarming. The enemy had already captured Poltava, was tearing towards Kharkov. There were bloody battles near Katyusha. We had to hurry. The forced march along the route Moscow-Tula-Kursk-Belgorod-Kharkov was not easy for us. After all, the drivers were not yet trained. We did not have time to conduct a single regimental exercise, did not work out the management of the mechanized column on the march. The regulation service had to master its duties right on the road. The regiment's rear was not coordinated. Unit commanders still did not know their subordinates well enough. At the specified time, the regiment passed the checkpoint and at dawn followed through the quiet, dusky Moscow. And then the fabulous birch groves of the Moscow region, lovely quiet streams and rivers, sad autumn fields floated by. On the roads one could feel the military order regulation posts, refueling points. Tula, the famous Yasnaya Polyana, Kursk, are behind us. For 2 days we safely made this march. We moved day and night. We had lunch hastily, where we refueled with fuel. On the march we were helped a lot by the conventional sign V, the first letter of the French word victoire, victory. This sign was painted in white on the cabs and sides of the vehicles. Therefore, the vehicles of the 4th Regiment could be easily noticed among the many others travelling along the military roads. At the turns of the road, reconnaissance put a pre-prepared sign with the sign of the regiment and an arrow indicating the direction of travel. In cities and towns, the conventional sign V was drawn with chalk or charcoal directly on the walls of houses. This method later helped us during forced marches, and especially when the route changed unexpectedly. The march was accomplished safely, except for a small incident. At dawn on September 18th, 1941, the regiment was about 15 kilometers from Belgorod. I decided to go ahead to make arrangements for fuel refueling, as well as to check the work of the quartermaster detachments, which were to outline the places of divisions' refuges. In order to know how the rear of the regiment was moving, I sent Lieutenant G. I. Brezgalov, adjutant, on a motorcycle to the rear of the column. After all, in those days we had few radios and we were saving them as the apple of our eye for the battle. Commissar Radchenko, who travelled along the marching orders on a motorcycle, after my departure, led the moving regiment. In a pickup truck, the driver N.D. Sobolov and I broke away from the head vehicles at a decent speed. The middle of September near Belgorod is still quite hot. The bright southern sun had risen and began to bake strongly. Needless to say that both me and the driver after the second sleepless night were very sleepy. The exhausted driver began to doze at the wheel. I encouraged him with jokes, but fatigue was taking its toll. And then I made a mistake. I decided to give Sobolov a chance to doze off and sat behind the wheel myself. At first Sobolov followed me closely, but the road was straight and smooth. He quickly calmed down and fell asleep. Soon I felt myself irresistibly overcome by drowsiness. I tried with all my might to cheer up, to drive away the fatigue, but it was all in vain. At some point my consciousness passed out. If the road had not made a turn to the left, perhaps everything would have been fine. But because of that turn, we ended up in a ditch. The pickup truck flipped upside down. I was on the bottom, the driver was on top of me. The cab was twisted, the doors couldn't be opened. Luckily for us, a truck with soldiers was passing by. After 100 meters, it stopped, and a few men ran up to us. "Are you all right, Comrade Major?" There was anxiety on the face of a freckled Efreyator. The soldiers immediately put the pickup on wheels. The accident occurred on soft black soil, and therefore we got only bruises, and the car dents on the fenders and body, and a small skew of the cabin. The engine and running gear, fortunately, were not damaged. A lot of gasoline leaked out of the tank. We refueled the pickup from a spare tank and drove to Belgorod. Of course, the driver sat behind the wheel now. In my commander's practice, I became more cautious about substituting chauffeurs from now on. Soon Belgorod, with chalky mountains overgrown with briars, quiet muddy river Oskol was left behind. Early in the morning, the regiment concentrated on the northern outskirts of Kharkov in a shady forest park. At 10 o'clock in the morning, we left with the Assistant Chief of Staff, Senior Lieutenant V. M. Solomon, and the Assistant for Logistics, Captain M.D. Demenko, to the headquarters of the Kharkov Military District, located at that time in Kharkov. The city met us with patrols at every corner, bristling with anti-tank hedgehogs. We had to solve the problem of supplying the regiment with all kinds of allowances, to get topographic maps. However, neither the commander of the troops of the district nor a member of the military council was at the headquarters, and without them no one could solve this issue. "Wait, they are about to arrive," reassured us on duty at headquarters. We waited for about an hour. Suddenly the door opened gustily, and a general in a dusty uniform entered the reception room with a quick gait. I realized that it was the commander of the district troops, Major General A. N. Chernikov, and reported to him about the arrival of the regiment. "Do you have the same installations that were used at Orsha?" he asked. I answered in the affirmative. "Very good." The general was pleased and began to ask where the regiment was, what condition it was in, how many rigs it had, whether it had shells and fuel. Immediately Chernikov gave an order to enroll the regiment on all types of allowances. The operators were ordered to familiarize me with the situation of the troops and to issue the necessary maps. Then the general turned to me. "The situation at the front is difficult, Major. Immediately stock up on everything you need. You will receive your combat mission at the regiment's location. I'll report your arrival to Marshal Timoshenko. I wish you success." And he shook my hand. Within a few hours at the district headquarters, we solved all the issues of support. In the afternoon, the regiment had fuel and food, and 5 volleys of shells we carried with us. In the evening, we had the first regimental party meeting. The determination to give their lives for the victory over the enemy sounded in every speech of the communists. At the meeting, the party bureau of the regiment was elected and tasks were set for the communists. The bureau consisted of the commissar and the regiment commander. Headed the party bureau political officer VP Korovnikov. The next day we came to us with a combat order regimental commissar FN Zhukov. We were ordered to go in full force to the section of the front, where the 14th Cavalry Division of General Vidi Krychenkin was defending. And it fought near the village of Dikanka, in the places sung by the great Gogol. Our regiment was now part of the newly created operational group of Guards mortar units of the Southwestern Front. The group was commanded by Colonel A.D. Zubanov. Members of the military council of the group were Regimental Commissar F.N. Zhukov and Senior Battalion Commissar A. K. Kiselev, Chief of Staff Major V. I. Voznyuk. The group at first included our regiment and 2 divisions of 7 GMP, which were still on the march. In the morning of September 24th, the regiment concentrated in the woods, about 15 kilometers northeast of Dikanka. Commissar Radchenko and I went to the headquarters of the 14th Cavalry Division in our pickup truck. Radchenko sat behind the wheel, and I with the map next to him. The driver Sobolev, Adjutant Lieutenant Brizgalov, and 1 machine gunner took places in the back. Radchenko drove the car classically. Therefore, I was absolutely calm for his non-staff driver. He and I often travelled together. On the road we exchanged opinions, sometimes even solved current affairs. However, our trips together did not last long. Having learned that once we came under artillery and mortar fire, and almost both of us were killed, the commander of the operational group of the GMCH front, Colonel Zubanov, by special order forbade us to ride in the same car, without special necessity. So, we were approaching the famous Dikanka. On the sides of the road proudly towered poplar trees, in the fields stacks of harvested bread, haystacks. And here was Dikanka. White houses were drowned in gardens, autumn flowers were growing in the front gardens. And behind the village there was a big forest. The road was blocked by a barrier. A cavalryman armed with a machine gun carefully checked our documents and showed us where to go. The headquarters was located on the outskirts of the village in a large, spacious hut. Horses were tethered near the fence. They were guarded by horsemen. We drove up to the headquarters itself. The horseman and the sentry at the entrance stretched out, saluting us. Having answered, we quickly entered a large room. Here on long benches sat fighters and commanders. Automatic rifles, carbines and gas masks were hung on the walls. Through the open door of the second room we could see that over a map laid out on a table, bent over a map, a naked, shaven-headed general. Next to him stood a tall major in a rather faded uniform. Opposite the general sat a light blonde battalion commissar with a kind, pleasant face. We asked permission to enter and introduced ourselves. General Kryuchenkin got up from the table, came up to us and shook hands firmly. I reported where the regiment was concentrated and in what composition. "I am glad to see you," said the general. "I have already been informed that an artillery regiment is due to arrive in our area." Then he introduced the battalion commissar and a Major Meet Commissar Dobryshin. "And this is the Chief of Staff, Major Shmilo. We've been fighting together since the first days of the war. We've had a lot of things." The general's cheek was cut by a deep scar, his right eye was squinted. This, as we later learned from Sergei Trofimovich Shmilo, was the result of a wound received during the Civil War. Major Shmilo, tall, trim, with an open, strong-willed face, gave the impression of a courageous and determined man. We immediately became firm friends with him. The commissar, calm, judicious, we also liked him very much. It was felt that between these people reigns complete mutual understanding, and they deeply respect each other. After all, the harsh conditions of combat life always cement friendship. In my report, I briefly dwelled on the organization of the regiment, its combat power, and the peculiarities of application. The regiment is designed to hit large targets. I reported it must be used to fight with clusters of infantry, cavalry and motorized units of the enemy, and cannot hit individual fire points, single tanks, or any structures because of the large dispersion of shells. The cavalryman listened to me with great interest. Speaking of the firepower of the regiment, I reported that we ourselves had not yet seen a regimental or even a battery salvo, that we had been shown only an incomplete salvo of one installation, which fired 8 shells. According to the instruction on combat use, I reported we can give a salvo only with the permission of the front command. After firing, the combat rigs must be immediately taken to cover in the area of waiting positions located in the rear, 5 to 10 kilometers away. To protect the combat vehicles in the areas of firing positions, commanders of supported formations should allocate cover rifle and machine gun units, anti-tank defense means. The general listened to me carefully, took a deep breath, and said reproachfully, "My doves. At first you made us very happy, but then you shocked us. It turns out that you still have to cover yourselves, and I have nothing to cover the division headquarters, Comrade General." I answered him, "We will guard the firing positions ourselves. We have 37mm guns and machine guns on the vehicles." "That's a different conversation," rejoiced the general. Then he showed us on the map the defense lines of the division, told us everything that is known about the enemy. It was very scanty information. The characterization of the regiments of the division made a rather depressing impression on us. We were struck by the fact that they were so few in number. The 14th Cavalry Division from the first days of the war fought heavy battles, and even now it was defending on a fairly wide front. The division consisted of 4 cavalry, 1 rifle regiment, and a motorized battalion. Listing the units, the general said, "There are a lot of regiments, but not enough forces. In recent battles we suffered heavy losses. The most dangerous direction the left flank, near Dikanka, and the right flank near Shishaki. I have familiarized you in detail with the state of the division so that you would be ready for any surprise. Have a reliable guard and continuously conduct reconnaissance. The general decided to place 2 divisions of the regiment near Dikanka and 1 on the right flank of the division. Areas of concentration and waiting positions were chosen, as required by the instruction on the combat use of Guards mortar units. The task was clarified, and we urgently departed to the location of the regiment. We decided to deploy our headquarters on the southeastern outskirts of Dikanka, not far from the division headquarters, with which we had to establish telephone communication. Soon General Kryuchenkin called me and the commissar again. In the division headquarters, we first met our immediate command, the head of the operational group of the Guards mortar units of the front, Colonel A.D. Zubanov, and the Chief of Staff of the group, Major V.I. Vozniuk. Zubanov, somehow immediately disposed to himself, in his every gesture felt confidence and strength. Vozniuk was a little taller than his chief, trim, held himself loosely and confidently. Before the war, they both served in the Penza artillery school. After reporting to Zubanov about the state of the regiment, we organized a show of combat vehicles to the command, and then went to the right flank, to the place Shishaki, where we conducted a reconnaissance and clarified on the map the front edge of our units. During the reconnaissance, we repeatedly came under artillery and mortar fire. Under enemy fire, everyone behaved calmly. Zubanov continued to give instructions, joking. Vozniuk was not inferior to him in jokes. His Ukrainian humor was irresistible. In the evening of September 24th, Zubanov and Vozniuk left for the front headquarters. Before leaving, Zubanov once again reminded me that volleys could be fired only with their permission. And then I asked him a question that had long tormented me. What to do if the situation requires an immediate volley and communication with the front will be broken? The task of each chief to ensure continuous communication with the senior staff, answered Zubanov. In addition, the division headquarters with the headquarters of the front has not only wire communication through the corps, but also direct radio communication. Having seen off the group command, we went to our command post with the permission of General Kryuchenkin. Here the division commanders were waiting for us. At night, on the division's defensive section, in the area of Dikanka, the divisions took the following combat order: in the center, the 2nd Division of Captain R.R. Vasilevich; on the right flank, the 1st Division of Captain V. Dobrozadova; and on the right flank, the 1st Division of Captain V. Dobrozadov; and on the left flank, 3rd Division of Captain P. M. Kudyak. Fire platoons were ordered to be in waiting positions in full combat readiness, and the commanders of divisions and batteries to be at observation posts, having previously established reliable communication with the fighting positions. I entrusted Senior Lieutenant Solomon with the selection of a place for the regimental observation post and its equipment, and with pleasure I was once again convinced of the exceptional conscientiousness and high artillery training of this commander. The observation point was equipped 1.5 kilometers west of Dikanka, on the edge of a large forest. From there, the front edge of our defences and the front line, on which the enemy's advanced units had entered, were clearly visible. Between our and German trenches ran a wide gully with gentle slopes overgrown with small bushes. A kilometre beyond the gully in the enemy's location was an oak grove, occupying about a kilometre along the front. This was the tract of Perarub. To the right and left of it, at a distance of 4 or 5 kilometres, visible farms. Solomon reported. The observation post is equipped. It installed a bussel and stereo tube. The enemy is being monitored. Established communication with the 70th Cavalry Regiment and its headquarters, laying a telephone line to the observation posts of the 1st and 3rd Divisions. In addition, surveillance of the enemy is organised from a tall oak tree, which is 100 metres to our right at the edge of the forest. But won't the observer be shot down by the fascists? It's too good a landmark. No, Comrade Commander, it's not so easy to spot. The crown is so thick, and even if they find it, it's not easy to shoot it down with a shell. The enemy has an observer on a trigonometric tower. It can't be. I marvelled. Are they completely crazy from the schnapps? And you look in the stereo tube, Solomon suggested. And indeed, on the top platform of the tower, like a rook in the nest, nestled fascist observer. "Why do you let him sit there and view the depth of our defences?" I asked angrily. "And what to do? You can't give a volley, and you can't reach him with a machine gun," Solomon answered. "Well, and artillery division of cavalrymen for what? The commander of the division says that he has few shells, and it is difficult to hit the tower. Take me to him." The observation post of the 32nd Artillery Division was a 5-minute walk away. The commander of the division, a senior lieutenant, apparently not experienced enough, confusedly confirmed that the shells are not enough, and to hit the tower requires a large consumption of ammunition. "Let's give it a try," I told him. "If we don't destroy the observer, we will drive him off the tower." On the map, carefully prepared data. The first fired shell exploded to the right of the tower. We made a correction. Second shot. Under range, we enlarged the site by 2 divisions. And again under range, added 2 more divisions. Overflight. I suggest the division commander to reduce the site by 1 division and move to defeat, without providing a narrow 2-division fork. He gives the command. 3 shells. Rapid fire. After the 376mm caliber grenades fired, the entire tower was shrouded in smoke. When it was carried away by the breeze, we saw that the tower stood as before, but one of its supports had been broken, and the observer had left his post. "Comrade Major." "That was a good job," said the division commander enthusiastically, "and we were taught that to destroy a point target requires a very large consumption of shells." "You were taught correctly. But here are the simplest conditions of firing. The range is short, the plane of fire passes almost through our point. We don't have to hit the observer in the forehead. It's enough to drive him off and prevent him from observing. So we've accomplished that task together, and now you've got the data you're looking for. I suppose you won't let the enemy sit with impunity on the tower and quietly consider our defence." With Solomon, we returned to our observation post. I established the coding of the terrain, outlined the landmarks. Communication with the observation posts of the divisions was established. By telephone, I once again reminded the division commanders that the enemy was closely monitored. Solomon was ordered to give them schemes of landmarks, terrain coding, areas of intended firing, and to check whether they had correctly specified the firing tasks and whether the data on the specified areas were prepared. After our firing, everything became quiet. But on the soul was somehow restless, and not in vain. Above us soon appeared spy plane. Anti-aircraft gunners drove it away. But just a few minutes later we heard an ominous rumble. 18 bombers passed over us in a formation and, turning sharply, began to come in for a strike. They bombed, however, not the firing positions, and Dikanka. In many places there were fires. Leaving Solomon in charge at the observation post, the adjutant and I went to the regimental headquarters. Crimson disk of the sun hid behind the horizon, and immediately in the lowlands floated shoals of fog. In the twilight seemed to melt, dissolved distant farms. The forest was darkening before our eyes. The Ukrainian night sung by Gogol was coming. Night in Dikanka. Radchenko came to the headquarters on a motorcycle. He said that the guardsman Ivan Miroshnichenko among the refugees met his fellow countrymen from his native village Kashenka. They told him the sad news. A week ago, fascist planes bombed an unarmed crowd of refugees. Ivan Miroshnichenko's sister was mortally wounded. His mother was concussed. The old man-father, sick and broken by grief, stayed in a foreign, almost deserted village. Kind people sheltered him. Miroshnichenko, despite the grief, keeps up well, said Radchenko. He asked me for a recommendation to the party. On the morning of September 25th, we arrived at the observation post with Commissioner Radchenko. Solomon reported that the night passed quietly. True, the fascists made a few gunshots, obviously targeting in different areas of our defences. During the night, fresh trenches appeared on the heights. It is necessary to suppose that these are new observation points of Hitlerites, as nobody else appeared on the trigonometric tower. Fresh trenches and firing points were also found on the edge of the Porub tract. Through the stereo telescope, I began to scrutinize the terrain. Indeed, the new targets detected by the enemy indicated that he was preparing for something. After all, in the first months of the war, the Nazis tried to sleep at night. Then we completely broke the enemy's daily routine. At 10 o'clock in the morning, I was called by phone by the commander of the 3rd Division, Captain Kudiak. He reported that enemy infantry and mounted groups were being drawn into the Perurub tract. An hour later, Kudiak was on the phone again. Visibly worried, he reported that all morning he had been observing how enemy infantry and cavalry were pulling into the tract. Kudiak asked permission to fire a volley. I was no less concerned than Kudiak. But what could be done? After all, firing without the permission of the front command was strictly forbidden. Once again, I had to remind Kudiak of this. At the same time, he was ordered to load the combat vehicles and keep the division in full combat readiness. I reported my decision to General Kryuchenkin and asked him to get permission from the front command to fire a salvo. General Kryuchenkin promised to do his best. In about 20 minutes, Kudiak reported that the division was ready for battle and again insistently asked for permission to fire a salvo. Comrade Kudiak. There is no reason for excitement, I answered him. How can there be no grounds? Kudiak shouted into the tube. The enemy is about to attack. His advanced chains have already appeared at the edge of the forest. When the enemy will attack, then we'll fire a volley, I assured him. However, I myself began to fear how not to be late with a volley. After all, before the attack, the enemy will certainly open artillery and mortar fire on our forward trenches and observation posts. He can immediately damage communications and then. I must confess that I too was waiting for Kryuchenkin's command with great excitement and impatience. Only a sense of special military sensitivity stopped me from calling the division commander. After all, it is clear that Kryuchenkin has not yet had time to contact the front headquarters. And suddenly the silence of the morning was broken by a powerful rumble echoing over the grove, over Dikanka, over near and far farms. To the left, behind us, from behind the forest, fiery comets were flying out in a continuous stream. They were making noise above our heads. In a few seconds, the whole tract was enveloped in thick black smoke, in which we could see bright flashes of explosions. Thunderous booms were heard. The noise of the flying shells, accompanied by a peculiar grinding sound, the rumble of the explosions, as well as the huge black cloud that instantly enveloped the grove, made a strong impression. When the smoke cleared a little, we saw Hitlerites mad with fear running from the grove in different directions, horses without riders galloping across the field. The psychological impact of the volley was so great that even we, who knew what it was, were shocked. After all, it was the first full-blooded volley of the division. It stunned not only the Nazis. General Kryuchenkin called us immediately. He scolded us for being AWOL. I listened to the division commander in silence, and then reported, Comrade General. The commander of the 3rd Division fired a volley without my command. This, of course, does not absolve me of responsibility for what happened. In my defense, I can only add that the volley was successful. The fascists are fleeing in panic. It's good that the fascists are fleeing, the general replied with a slightly lower tone. But our units are not warned and do not pursue the enemy. As soon as the small cavalry squadrons learned that this powerful fire attack made by our new artillery, they began to pursue the enemy. Soon General Kryuchenkin arrived at our observation post. Having seen with his own eyes the results of the volley, he changed from anger to mercy. That's how the Guards. Well done. Despite some delay, squadrons of the 76th Cavalry Regiment, pursuing the enemy, captured prisoners and trophies. The salvo was reported to the front headquarters. Colonel Zubanov was extremely indignant that the fire had been opened without authorization. He demanded an investigation and punishment of those responsible. In the evening of the same day, I interrogated Kudiak with partiality. Kudiak, stretched out, often blinking his kind grey eyes, answered directly and honestly. I'm guilty, Comrade Commander, but I can't add anything. I couldn't resist, that's all. After all, they, the bastards, began to come out of the forest in a deployed formation. If I had waited for permission, we would have been late in opening fire. You couldn't see, but I was watching everything as if I were in the palm of my hand. I warned Kudiak sternly, but did not punish him, because, frankly speaking, I was pleased with his actions. To think what could have happened to the 3rd Division, and to the whole regiment, if Kudiak had not fired a volley. But at the same time, arbitrariness was not to be encouraged. Although in war it is sometimes difficult to distinguish between AWOL and reasonable initiative. I ended my conversation with him like this. Your good fortune, Comrade Kudiak, is that winners are not judged. You fired a successful and timely salvo, but from now on such nervousness should never be allowed. Kudiak left me brightened and visibly cheered up. This unscheduled volley opened a glorious page of the combat history of the 4th Guards Mortar Regiment. On the defence of the 14th Cavalry Division, our regiment operated from September 24th to October 1st, 1941. During this time, the division not only held the occupied line, but also managed to advance its left flank by 12 to 18 kilometres. All divisions of our regiment were involved in active combat operations, and their battery and divisional salvos disrupted every attempt of the enemy to concentrate on any area of its forces and go on the offensive. Here is how it is said about the combat work of our regiment at this time in the log of combat operations of the division. At 11.001 Division of the 4th GMP opened fire on Fedorovka, where the enemy cavalry was concentrated. After shelling, Hitlerites fled, leaving Fedorovka. In total, with 3 to 4 battalions of infantry and up to 5 enemy batteries operated in front of the division. The enemy inflicted heavy losses by artillery fire of 4 GMP. During the whole day in Stasi, the Germans buried the dead. Having come to their senses after our blows, the fascist command tried to delay the advance of the Soviet cavalrymen by all means. For this purpose, on the left flank, where after the first salvo our troops advanced, the enemy pulled up fresh forces. Since the division was defending on a wide front, and it had only one cavalry artillery division, Major General Kryuchenkin obtained the permission of the front commander to use our regiment at his discretion. We could now give salvos with the permission of General Kryuchenkin. In these days we had to make the first night salvos. It happened under the following circumstances. 105mm battery of the enemy shelled our observation posts with impunity. We suffered losses. We could not suppress it from our firing positions. In order to destroy the battery, the coordinates of which were determined accurately, the commander of the 2nd Division, Captain R.R. Vasilevich, proposed to take the combat vehicles at night to the front edge of our defences, and from there to give a volley. The whole operation was carried out so quickly and unexpectedly for the enemy that he did not have time to open not only artillery but also machine gun fire. The shelling of our observation posts and the fighting order of the squadrons stopped. September 29th was a nice warm day. The road leading from Poltava to Dikanka was clearly visible from the observation posts. On it moved columns of German troops. They flocked to the grove northwest of Petrovka village. We determined the area of Nazi concentration accurately, put it on the map. However, it was out of reach of our batteries from the main firing positions. The enemy, apparently after our first volleys, did not risk to concentrate their troops in close proximity to the front line. In order to cover the Hitlerites with our volleys, having already had experience of night firing, we decided to take out under the cover of darkness combat vehicles behind our front line, on the line of guard. V.V. Dobrozadov was ordered to send a reconnaissance team led by Captain N.V. Machushov. In its composition were to be battery commanders. They were entrusted with the final selection of firing positions and reconnaissance of ways of approach. At night, the battery commanders were to take their combat vehicles to firing positions. We reasoned as follows: the Nazis were tired, so the vigilance of the combat guard was lowered. The terrain allowed unnoticeably to lead the vehicles into the gully that lay in the neutral strip. Our ally should be the dark southern night. We came to the conclusion that such an operation, although it involves a certain amount of risk, is possible. All the more that with our own forces we can organize a reliable cover of firing positions. With the onset of darkness at the observation post appeared Captain Mityushov. He reported that the road and firing positions are scouted. Dobrozhidov and Mityushov left for the divisions, and the commissar and I decided to discuss the question of when to report to General Kryuchenkin about the night volley. We couldn't talk about it over the phone. To go with the report, it would take a lot of time. We were forced to make a decision to act and report to the general after the plan was fulfilled. With a column of loaded combat vehicles we met on the road. Radchenko, Dobrozhidov and I drove a pickup truck ahead. In 300–400 meters from the front line, all dismounted and followed the guard, which led Mityushov. The forward units had been warned about our going behind the defence line. As soon as the guard took the combat order, the units with extinguished lights one after another began to go into position. The division commander reported on the readiness. Fire, I commanded. It was the first time we were so close to the firing vehicles. Before that, during the salvos, we were usually at observation posts, but now on the right flank of the division, about 30 to 40 meters from the fighting vehicles. We were presented with a terrific picture. First, the combat vehicles lined up in a row at shortened intervals were illuminated by a bright light. These were the torches of the jets of the first fired shells. Then there was a piercing screech that made the ground shake. Fire arrows with dazzling tails began to fly from the high raised trusses in a continuous stream. Behind the vehicles, grey clouds formed at first, which from the bright illumination turned into orange and white clubs and swirls before their eyes. From the shells rushing upwards, it seemed that everything floated downwards, both the fighting vehicles and the brightly illuminated area. Subsequently, I had to observe night salvos up close more than once, but nothing could compare with this first impression left by the night volley of the division near Dikanka. The torch of the last shell was extinguished, and everything around was plunged into pitch blackness, as it always happens after the bright light of night. We heard the thunderous booms of the explosions. There was a strong smell of gunpowder and dust. The night volley so stunned the Hitlerites that within 15 to 20 minutes not a single shot was fired from their side. In complete silence and darkness, the fighting vehicles left the firing position, and like huge black shadows, one after another began to go to the rear. Having seen off the last vehicle, the commissar and I got into a pickup truck and drove to our NP. When we were approaching it, several flares flew into the air one after another over our front line. Frenzied rifle and machine gun fire went up, indiscriminate firing of guns and mortars rumbled. Artillery and mortar raids were undertaken by the enemy on different parts of our defences, and especially on our abandoned firing position. In the area of the enemy's concentration, on which we gave a volley, were observed bright blazes of fire. General Kryuchenkin, who called to our NP, in a stern voice ordered to report what was the matter, why the volley was given without his permission. I replied that everything was in order, but I could report the details only in person. Very well. Come immediately. The general's voice sounded more calm. Half an hour later, the commissar and I were at General Kryuchenkin's office. Listening to my report, he was rubbing his hands together, his stern eyes becoming more and more kind. At last he could not stand it, jumped up from his seat, walked quickly around the hut, exclaiming excitedly, "Well done, well done. But there is no one to beat you. It's great that you managed to cover the enemy. But what if we'd been hit? You could have died foolishly yourself." "What then?" "Answer Kryuchenkin, right? Comrade General, there was no opportunity to report to you. We would have lost time. We were firmly convinced that we'd fulfill our plan without losses. And who knows, if we hadn't hit the fascists today, perhaps tomorrow morning they would have attacked us. I repeat, you beat the enemy skillfully, well done. But you have to report and then fire salvos. You are secret. I still have to cover you." In the voice of the general sounded paternal notes. Radchenko and I realized that the storm had passed. Of course, such independence could cost us dearly. But life, the combat situation, made its own adjustments and sometimes required immediate action. On October 1st, 1941, the regiment received a combat order to redeploy to the area of the town of Valky, Kharkov region. The command of the 14th Cavalry Division issued the following order in this connection. Order of the Cavalry Division, Order of Lenin, Red Banner, Red Star, sponsored by the Kim named after Parkhomenko. October 1st, 1941 M. Dikanka. No. 37. During 7 days from 24.9 to 1.10 1941, the 4th Guards Mortar Regiment participated in the operation together with the 14 Cavalry Division entrusted to me. In the course of fighting, all the personnel of the regiment showed exceptional skill and clarity in the performance of combat tasks, personal endurance and readiness for self-sacrifice. Despite the clear superiority of the enemy in strength, its maneuvering on the battlefield, the command of the regiment, represented by the commander of the 4 GMP Major Nestorenko and Battalion Commissar Radchenko, quickly and clearly set the regiment combat tasks, which he honourably performed, and skillfully using the power of a new formidable weapon. All attempts of the enemy to create a concentration of troops and go on the attack were thwarted by the apt fire of the Guardsmen. The enemy suffered heavy losses. The combat tasks were accomplished. For exceptionally accurate work, the use of all the power of the new equipment, skillful maneuvering fire on the battlefield, trouble-free management and performance of combat tasks to the commander of 4 GMP Major Nestorenko, Commissar 4 GMP Battalion Commissar Radchenko, and all the personnel of the regiment, I declare gratitude. I express confidence that the 4th Guards Mortar Regiment, acting on any section of the front, will be even more and more apt to smash and destroy the fascist hordes. Guardsmen. For Stalin, for the motherland, always be ready to give an accurate, all-destroying volley. The commander of the 14th Cavalry Division, Major General. Battalion Commissar of the 14th Cav Division. Chief of Staff of the 14th Cavalry Major. This first award to the regiment, the gratitude of combat comrades, was especially dear to us. In the archives of the division, after the war, one found the following record, which revived in my memory those distant days. According to the testimony of prisoners from the 101st Infantry Division of the enemy, 101 PD suffered heavy losses, up to 30 to 40% of its composition, from the fire of the 4 Guards Mortar Regiment. In 1970, I received a letter from the residents of Dikanka. Here is what they wrote. We know that in September 1941 you commanded a regiment of Katyusha and gave the first volley from Dikanka. Your soldiers called their weapon Miracle Cannon. You delayed the Germans for 14 days, destroyed a lot of enemy manpower and equipment. We, residents of Dikanka, decided to put a monument to the first Katyusha in the park named after Gogol, and we want to ask you to send us your memories. Maybe you have photos of your comrades, front newspapers, posters, or any other materials related to the first Katyusha volleys near Gogol's Dikanka. Send them to the following address: USSR, Poltava Region, Dikanka Village, Historical Museum, or Rayvoenkomat. Help us through the Ministry of Defense to buy a Katyusha of 1941. We will put it on a pedestal and write the names of soldiers who fired the first volley near Dikanka. Our young people, who are going to serve in the Soviet Army, will get their first lessons of courage near the monument to the Katyusha. When the monument will be built, we will invite you to the opening. Then there was a note: many tourists, both foreign and domestic, come to Dikanka in summer. They ask about the Katyusha volley. There are no materials in the museum, but people know that this is history. It only remains to add that the BM-13 installation now rises on a pedestal in Dikanka as a monument to the first crushing blows of Katyushas on the enemy. In the combat log of the GMCH Task Force of the Southwestern Front, there are some stingy lines. On 4.100.414 GMP, started to fulfill the combat task on the front of the 38th Army on the section Kochubievka, Vinnikov. Behind this record are interesting and instructive events. On October 4th in the afternoon, the regiment was on the march, going to the defence area of the 38th Army units. To receive the task, the commissar and I rode forward to the headquarters of the division, which we were to support with fire. The division commander informed us that his regiments were defending on a wide front, that there was no elbow contact with the neighbour on the right. He gave us the task of preparing barrage fires on the most dangerous directions. Having clarified it, Radchenko and I drove out to meet the regiment. The day was clear, the air was clear in the fall. The field road, still untouched by thaw, looked like an asphalt highway. We soon had to be convinced of the peculiarities of Ukrainian roads by our own experience. As good as they are in dry weather, they are just as treacherous and almost impassable during rains. But so far nature helped us. The pickup truck swept the rolled-up strip of primer under itself. To the right and left stretched the fields, hills rose, in the gullies darkened forests. From the division headquarters we had already moved away 4 or 5 kilometers, when suddenly we saw that on the left, on the slope of the nearest hill, a rider was galloping at full speed in front of us and desperately waving his cap. Flying up to us on a rearing horse, a cavalryman excitedly reported. "A fascist column is coming out of the forest." Radchenko and I looked at each other. "This is in the rear of the division. You can see it from the hill." "Come on, let's go to the hill." I ordered the driver. The cavalryman rode ahead across the field, and we followed him. Yes, indeed, through binoculars was clearly visible enemy column, which moved along the field road, about 3 kilometers from us. Ahead of it rode a group of horsemen, behind it covered vapor wagons. The terrain was descending toward us. The column was coming at some angle toward us, and was well in full view. What bastards! Radchenko could not contain his rage, moving as if on parade. We're not there yet, otherwise would have knocked them down. We sent a cavalryman to the division headquarters, and we rushed to meet our divisions. Half a kilometer away, we saw the fighting vehicles. It was the 3rd Division, in the head of which on a semi-truck rode its commander, Captain Kudiak. I mentally calculated if we deploy the division for firing from a closed position, then, while we will extend the connection to the hill, where should be our NP, and while the firing platoons are deployed, the enemy column will come even closer and enter the dead zone. Then our volleys will be powerless. True, there was another way out to move back 6-7 kilometers and from there to give a volley. But during this time the enemy column can hide in the woods and beams or change the direction of movement. In addition, there was another circumstance related to the peculiarities of the fire of our weapons. The fact that the dispersion of rocket shells is much greater than the dispersion of conventional artillery shells. When firing at the maximum range, the dispersion ellipse is stretched along the front. When firing at minimum range, on the contrary, it is stretched along the firing path. So if we were to move to the maximum range, the salvo would be across the direction of movement of the enemy column. If we fired from the minimum range, the ellipse of shell dispersion would cover the column along its length. I told Radchenko, "Ivan Nikiforovich, you were trying to knock the Nazis down. Now we have such an opportunity. Let's take the main battery to the hill and give a volley of direct fire." "How are we going to do that?" He shifted his eyebrows in surprise. "After all, the Nazis are less than 3 kilometers away. And while we will withdraw the battery, they will come even closer. Have you forgotten that our minimum range of fire is 3 kilometers? Remember how they showed us firing at the firing range. The range was no more than 1.5 or 2 kilometers. They opened the ramps on purpose. And we'll shoot from the hillside facing the enemy. It's a good slope. It will help us to reduce the aim." Needless to say, I didn't have to convince the combat commissar twice. "Let's risk it," he said enthusiastically. "We must teach the bastards a lesson." So the division commander, Captain Kudiak, was ordered to immediately charge the main battery and have shells for the second salvo. The rest of the batteries were tasked to move back 6 or 7 kilometers and take the battle order to repel the advancing enemy. In 5 to 8 minutes I was reported on the readiness of the battery. As soon as the units in a deployed formation over the top of the hill and began to descend the slope, the command was given to stop and point the combat vehicles in the center of the column. At this time its head was only about 2 kilometers away from us. To be sure to cover the column with a volley, we gave 4 firing shots. The shells exploded with a big underflight. The fascists did not seem to pay any attention to our shots. The column continued to move in the same direction, confidently and brazenly. Well, wait a minute, I thought. Is this how you're going to sing now a correction was put into the sights? At the fascist bastards' volley. Fire. The first salvo of direct-fire rocket artillery was accurate. The column was covered from head to tail. When the smoke and dust dispersed, we saw that along the road were lying corpses of Hitlerites, burning cars and wagons. The surviving Nazis rushed in different directions. They ran, fell, got up and again ran to the forest, from which the column had just left. Fighting vehicles withdrew to the reverse slope of the hill. It was decided to give the second salvo on the edge of the forest, where the Nazis retreated. It is necessary to emphasize one special quality of the salvo of rocket shells. The point is that both material, if one can put it that way, and moral effect of simultaneous bursting of a group of shells is much higher than the effect of consecutive bursts of the same number of shells. This quality was immediately noticed as soon as our combat vehicles appeared in the troops. During simultaneous bursting of several shells in a limited area from different directions, shock waves act from different directions. Their addition, i.e., counter blows, significantly increases the destructive effect of each projectile. The waves are added up if the time difference between bursts does not exceed 0.8-1 second. The peculiarity of the rocket artillery salvo is that this effect is fully utilized here. It should be said that during our offensive actions in 1944 to 1945, when the density of artillery per kilometre of the front greatly increased and the fire of a large number of guns concentrated on limited areas, a similar effect was observed. In the first months of the war, the enemy tried to move along the roads and had, as a rule, dense battle orders. And that's what we needed. In addition, the infantry and equipment of the Nazis were bunched up. At the beginning of the war, the Nazis, intoxicated with victories, concentrating for the offensive as a rule, did not care about the shelter of their troops and military equipment, and therefore they were good targets for rocket launchers. In these conditions, the sudden salvo fire achieved a great striking and moral effect. At the loss of surprise, the enemy had time to go into hiding, and the effect of fire decreased. However, maneuverability and the advantages of multi-loading combat units, their firepower in short periods of time, counted in seconds, until the end of the war remained the privilege of reactive artillery. The M13 division could fire 192 shells of 132mm caliber in 8-10 seconds. An artillery division of the corresponding caliber could fire only 12 to 24 shells in the same time. It is true that as the duration of firing increased, the number of shells fired by BM-13 and BM-8 combat vehicles approached the number of shells fired by artillery guns, as it took much longer to reload the units than to reload the guns. However, it should be noted here that the number of shells fired from artillery guns is limited by the technically permissible mode of fire. If the established mode is violated, the gun barrels fail. For combat vehicles, this limitation does not exist. For example, the 4th Guards Mortar Regiment in the battles near Stalingrad in August 1942 for several days fired thousands of shells at the enemy. The mode of fire for the combat vehicles was determined by the availability of shells and the physical ability of the combat crews. But let's return to the first salvo of direct fire. In 6 to 8 minutes, the loaded combat vehicles again went to the top of the hill, and again a powerful organ rattled over the fields and forests, and in 15 to 20 seconds the forest edge was shrouded in smoke, and we heard the thunderous roar of bursting shells. The fascists had gotten their fill. It was time to leave. The commissar and I got into a pickup truck and followed the retreating battery. No sooner had we left a kilometre away than fascist planes appeared above the height from which the salvos were fired. They came one after another and bombed the nearby forest and the bushy ravine at the foot of the height. Here, the wind carried the cloud of smoke formed during the salvos, and the installations were already safe. But still, how did you think to shoot from such a distance? Radchenko's good-natured face had the joy of a gambling fighter and pride for his comrades and weapons. I thought about it even during the first demonstration at the range. After all, the design flaw of the combat unit is immediately visible. Watching the firing from the ramps, I realized that it is possible to shoot at close ranges. And now we were helped not only by the hill, but also by the slope in our direction of the road on which the column was moving. The slope greatly reduced the depth of dispersion. In a dozen seconds we defeated such a large column, said Radchenko thoughtfully. We need to teach this method of firing all the batteries of the regiment. Radchenko and I decided to write to Moscow about the design shortcomings of combat installations and make suggestions. Later we learned that regardless of our experience, direct fire was used by many Guards mortar divisions operating on different fronts. The laws of war demanded this method of firing, despite the design shortcomings of the combat vehicles.